Hey, so in this video, I am going to be talking about the United States in World War I, and I am going to try to answer three questions. So the first question is, why didn't the United States enter the war in 1914? The second question will be, why did the United States then join the war in 1917? And the third question will be, well, what impact did the United States have when they did enter the war? So the first question, why didn't the United States enter the war in 1914, can really be answered in one word, and that one word is isolationism. So isolationism basically means that a country takes care of itself and doesn't really get involved with other countries. They tend to themselves, they keep to themselves. And the United States has a long history of isolationism. And it goes back to George Washington. In his farewell address, he warned against making permanent alliances. And then in his first inaugural address, Thomas Jefferson says we shouldn't get involved in any entangling alliances. And so there's this long, deep history of isolationism in the United States. And that isolationist tendency continues all the way through the beginning of World War I. And in fact, the United States president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, he was first elected to the presidency in 1912, before the war began, and then he ran for re-election in 1916. And in his re-election campaign, one of the campaign slogans was, "He kept us out of war." So in other words, vote for me because I will maintain America's isolationism, and if you vote for the other guy, that other guy might bring you into a war. So why didn't the United States join the war in 1914? Mostly because of this long history of isolationism. Most Americans saw it as a war that's happening over there. That's Europe's war. It has nothing to do with us. Um, Three notes, little digressions about American isolationism. The first digression is that when Americans thought about isolationism, it almost always meant not getting involved in things going on in Europe. The United States had no problems getting involved in, other countries' affairs in Latin America or other parts of North America. So there's a little bit of a cognitive dissonance. Like, we are isolationists, but we're also going to fight a war against Spain to take, over Cuba and things like that. A second digression is that the United States really moved away from its isolationist history during and after the Second World War. So after the Second World War in particular, the United States became very involved in world affairs, and it was not just taking part in, but really leading organizations like the United Nations and NATO. So the United States really moved away from isolationism during the Cold War. Interestingly, in 2016, then candidate Trump made a campaign promise to return America to a more isolationist positions. And he has really delivered on some of those. So, for example, the war in Afghanistan is now ending. A war that has been going on for most of your lives is coming to an end. And he also got out of things like the Paris Climate Accord. So both of those can be seen as examples of President Trump's isolationist policies. Um, and then a third just interesting note that isn't so much about isolationism, but just prior to the United States getting involved in the war, when they were kind of thinking, well, if we did get involved in the war, which side would we join, right? Because remember, this was not a war about ideology. So it wasn't like, this was a war for democracy or against authoritarianism. And there was, in fact, a large German American population that kind of assumed if the United States did get involved in the war, it would actually ally with Germany and not with England or France. So, but that, of course, didn't happen, but just an interesting thought. So why didn't the United States get involved in the war in 1914? Isolationism. All right, the second question, well, if the United States has this long isolationist history, why then did it get involved in the war in 1917? And the answer to that question can be connected to German U-boats sinking American commercial vessels, okay? So a U-boat, what is a U-boat? A U-boat is a submarine. And prior to the war, the British had the strongest navy by far, right? They were the most powerful navy in the world. And What the Germans did early on is that they developed a lot of U-boats, a lot of submarines, and these submarines were super effective. So that when the war began, Germany really became the most powerful navy, largely because of its effective use of U-boats. And they were deadly, and because they were underwater, you couldn't really see them, and they just sank so many British naval ships and the Germans really almost won the war at sea. We tend to think of World War I in terms of trenches and the land war, but it was also happening at sea. And in that part of the war, the Germans, at least initially, did very, very well. And in addition to attacking British naval ships, which makes sense, Germany and Britain were at war, Germany also attacked American commercial ships. And that one requires a little bit more explanation. And the reason that the Germans targeted American commercial ships is because America did a lot of trade with Britain, right? So it would send a lot of its resources. America sent things like wheat and steel to Britain. And from America's perspective, that's just what countries do, right? They trade with one another, and we have a lot of wheat, and you want wheat, so we'll sell it to you. Um, and that doesn't seem like it's an act of war or anything like that. However, the Germans saw that as an act of war because World War I was a war of attrition, right? The way that you were going to win this war is that the other side was going to run out of stuff, right? That's how you were going to win. It wasn't going to be this great tactical, Napoleon getting his army around something. It was just which side was going to run out of stuff first. And so when the Germans saw the Americans sending wheat and steel to England, they said, well, that wheat is going to feed British soldiers, and that steel is going to be used to make, tanks and bullets and all this other stuff. So it's not really just economic, you're actually helping the British military. And so the Germans attacked American commercial vessels. And the most famous story of a German attack of a non-military vessel is in 1915. In 1915, the Germans sank the Lusitania. The Lusitania was not an American ship, it was actually a British ship. And it was made by the same company that made the Titanic. So if you want to have a vision in your mind of like, what does the Lusitania look like? It looked a lot like the Titanic. It was almost as big, but not quite as big as the Titanic. And it was primarily a commercial vessel that brought people from Liverpool to New York. So if you wanted to go from Europe to the United States, the easiest and best way to do that was to take a boat from Liverpool to New York. And because this was the most common line, just as on an airplane today, there were lots of nationalities that would take this boat, right? You would have British and Americans, but you might have other European nationalities on this boat as well. And on this boat were at least 100 American civilians, right? These were just people who wanted to travel from the United States to Europe for whatever reason. But also on the boat were supplies. There were things like ammunition and things like that. And so one of the German submarines was given an order to attack this boat, and it carried out that attack in 1915. And many Americans and others lost their lives. And this had a big impact on American public opinion, right? Before the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, almost no Americans wanted anything to do with this war. But because the Germans had attacked American civilians, that really began to change American public opinion. And this didn't directly lead to the United States entering the war, the sinking of the Lusitania, because the Lusitania sank in 1915 and the Americans didn't join the war until 1917. So there's a big stretch of time right there, but did a lot to change American public opinion. So why did the United States join the war in 1917? Mainly because Germany was attacking American commercial ships, so to protect American economic interests. One little side note here is that the Americans joined in the spring of 1917 and kind of started ramping up their getting soldiers over there in the spring and summer of 1917. And the Russians dropped out of the war a few months after that. And the Russians dropped out of the war because this was a war of attrition, and the Russians really ran out of stuff. Their country completely fell apart because of the war. And we'll talk more about what happened in Russia in 1917. But one interesting thing about Russia dropping out of the war is that Wilson could now frame World War I as a war for democracy, right? Because Russia was not a democracy. It was, it had an emperor, a czar, but once Russia dropped out, now our two closest allies are France, a democracy, and England, a democracy. So even though it wasn't really a war about protecting democracy, Wilson could frame it as a war to save democracy. And that's how he presented it to the American people. Join World War I. This is a war to save democracy. Okay, so we know why America didn't enter the war in 1914 because of isolationism. We know why it did enter the war in 1917 because Germany was attacking American commercial ships. And then the last question is, well, what difference did it make? Did the United States entrance into World War I have any impact on the war? And the answer is yes, it did. There were lots of stories when the United States soldiers first arrived that they were quite poorly trained. The United States, because it was isolationist, it really didn't have a big army in 1917. It didn't have a lot of soldiers, and certainly not a lot of well-trained soldiers. So lots of stories when the Americans first showed up of just being poorly trained and not very good in battle. However, of course, they got better trained and more experienced as 1917 and 1918 progressed. But the bigger impact, even more so than just the soldiers, was that, again, this was a war of attrition. And therefore, what the Americans brought with them was, in addition to soldiers, they brought stuff. They brought steel. They brought tanks. They brought bullets. And this was one of the big factors in the Allies winning the war, was all of the American resources. On the home front, American entry into World War I did lead to anti-German bias and prejudice. Two examples. One would be that Vassar College fired all of its professors that taught German in 1917. And a second fact I learned from Trivial Pursuit, so I've never really fact-checked this, and maybe this is erroneous, but according to Trivial Pursuit, at the very least, that prior to 1917, French toast, what we now called French toast, was then called German toast, but was changed to French toast because of anti-German sentiment after World War I, after America entered World War I. So anyway, that's the video, and talk to you all later. Bye.